self-explanatory, and I think most older farmers would agree that no one goes toe-to-toe with Mother Nature and wins over an extended period of time. I had the opportunity to go to a no-till conference in Salina, Kansas earlier this year, and there was a very wonderful speaker, and his name was Dr. Frank Potenza, and he talked a lot about some things that I'm going to borrow and we're going to talk about today, and I'll try to always give credit where credit is due. But I would like to talk today basically about three things. First of all, I would like to talk about the ever-changing nature of our world and the dynamism of life here on this planet, and how it affects us as we go about and other creatures go about trying to make a living for ourselves and our families. Then I'd like to move on and spend a little time looking at the ecologic and economic costs associated in general with society as well as agriculture, and what we might do to reduce some of those costs. And finally, look at some of the boundaries we create for ourselves and others, and talk about ways we might transcend those boundaries. I very much try to be a conservationist. There's a large debate about what conservation is. Many times conservation gets confused with preservation. Much of what people call conservation is actually preservation. But I believe conservation is something different entirely. I believe conservation has more to do with stewardship, as we talked about earlier, trying to be a good steward of the resources in our care, trying to use them wisely for both our benefit and the benefit of others. I believe that this is what differentiates conservation from preservation. Preservation would be more like hiding that talent deep within the earth and not multiplying the talents. Conservation is an entirely attainable goal. I don't believe preservation is. And mainly, I didn't get the question. But mainly, preservation is not possible because things are always changing. Things never were the way they were, and they never will be again. As I said earlier, I intend to use some things that Dr. Potenza talked about, and now would be that time. I'm going to quote him, and I usually don't prepare this many notes, but I did today because I really wanted to get this right. I thought it was really worth hearing. But he said, all things are interconnected and interdependent. The issues that we face today, from invasive species and weeds, for instance, to cancer and heart disease, to the war on cancer and the war on terror and climate change, all have strands that are linked ecologically, socially, and economically. To make matters even more interesting, existence is relationships among organisms ever transforming from their birth until their death. While we often say, quote, that the only constant in life is change, that platitude doesn't address the profound implication of the dynamism of life. The quote, war to end all wars quickly morphed from World War I into World War II, to the Cold War, to the war on terror. In the blink of an eye, antibiotics to end bacterial infection created antibiotic-resistant superbugs. Herbicides to end weeds created herbicide-resistant plants and superweeds. And the war on cancer illustrates how the growth of normal cells into cancer cells is an astonishing display of life ever randomly mutating and evolving within conditions unique to each individual person. So while we endeavor to know, quote, the cause of issues, and then to develop, quote, fundamental solutions to address those issues, life is too richly complex for such one-dimensional thinking. Even when we find solutions to problems, they quickly become irrelevant as conditions change. So the challenge of change never ends, basically, and the only constant in life is change. Many times we are reluctant to embrace change because we see it as anomalous. We consider our time here to be long because it seems that way to us. But really, when you think about it, our time here is much too brief to see continents drift apart, to see vast oceans become deserts, to see climates warm and cool endlessly as they change. Paleontologists say that 99.99 90% of species that ever lived on this planet are now extinct. And the truth is, the change is just constant and continuous. How do we fit in there? How do we do? We know the earliest civilizations that we know of, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. I want to point out that currently we consider that there are 500,000 invasive plant and animal species in the U.S. We spend $120 billion a year trying to control them with very few positive results. I think that all the money, by the way, spent to control the Burmese python is money well spent. There is no place for him here. But just, we have to do some of this, but it's a real problem. I think that Cater did a really good job talking about some of the insects and foreign terrorists and whatnot. But we spend an incredible amount of money trying to control these things. We, a lot of times, when we have efforts to preserve things or to restore things, we don't really take into account how fast things actually change. Usually, when people talk about restoring some population or their restored population, they're talking about, before Europeans came to this continent and whatnot. But really, when you try to look back and take a picture, it's impossible to do because it's moving target. So the species that we consider to be native species were once the invaders. And it will always be that way over a long amount of time. So really, it's hard to think about things in that way. We have along with those ideas, I would like to introduce another concept, and this kind of brings us to the second part of our presentation, in which we'll talk about rising social, ecological, and environmental costs that we incur as a world, a nation, and a community. To introduce this topic, I would like to talk about the concept of thermodynamics and entropy. Entropy has to do with two things, really, with both of the laws of thermodynamics. First law states that energy can either be created or destroyed. And the second law states that as energy changes forms, entropy increases. That is to say, it decays into less and less useful forms. So with each transformation, we have a loss of useful energy, or in other words, the system is winding down. And the point I would like to make here is that all civilizations accelerate entropy. Unlike natural systems, which are incredibly efficient, at least thermodynamically speaking, because of the way the energy flows through the system and intricate webs, natural systems are constantly changing, adapting, and correcting as they move forward in time. Human systems are much different. So when we think about the oldest and longest lasting civilizations that we know of, we know that we have some Chinese dynasties that date back maybe 4,000 years. None of them lasted more than 500 to 800 years. The Roman Empire was a tremendous exception in lasting 1,200 years. By comparison, the United States has been in existence a mere 239 years. In the book, A Moderate Greatness by William Oculus, he points out that human civilizations typically last 10 generations, or roughly 250 years, as they evolve through 5 stages. From pioneers to commerce, and then to affluence, intellect, and finally decadence. And as I think and look around and think about some of the things that I've seen in my life, think about some of the experiences that maybe I've at least shared through my father. I had direct knowledge of my grandfather, and a lot of you in here are even older than I am. But if you think about your parents and your grandparents, I think that we've lived through maybe as much as 125 years of history, or at least been exposed to it. So I think that if we think about this, that maybe we can all relate to some of these things that we see up here, and maybe we can see some of these things happening. And I don't say this to be a doom and gloomer, but I'd really like to just kind of think about, how are we doing as a nation? When you think about being resourceful, or when people talk about a resourceful people, what are they usually talking about? Anytime somebody talks about a resourceful people, they're usually resourceful because they don't have many resources. And so they use them very wisely. How wisely do we use our resources? I read this and put some stuff together. Approximately 40% of the food in the United States goes to waste. And this is not so much different than globally. Globally, 1/3 of the produced food goes to waste in the world. Now, it's for a different reason. In most places, it's because of a lack of infrastructure. A lot of it gets lost, gets wasted, rots. Here, we waste the vast majority of it at the consumer level and food service level. But it's a lot of waste. People like to talk about some things, but we're not doing better. When you think back to your parents and your grandparents, I think we've really lost something now that we've just nearly entirely lost the Depression era generation. When we still had them around, they remembered what it was like to be without. And now, just about everyone who was old enough to remember the Depression is gone. And so now that we've had plenty and we seem to waste more, and I'm as guilty as anyone, but the time to do something about that is now, because procrastination is never a good thing, especially for Bernice. That's not the best one. Don't worry too much. But how are we doing? This is an interesting chart. I didn't realize that there are 40.5 million acres of lawn grown in the United States. Now keep in mind that that's not all irrigated. But when you lay that against the other irrigated crops, 9.7 million acres of corn, 6.2 of alfalfa, 5.3 soybeans, 4 orchards, cotton is not even on the top of the list. And you look at the water use on these. Alfalfa uses 14.3 million acre feet per year, corn at 11.7, and the lawns at 10.5. It's anywhere from 30 to 60% of residential water use. Interestingly enough, based on satellite imagery, if all of that lawn was kept in perfect health, it would take closer to 60 million acre feet. I haven't been very good about watering my grass this summer, and so that's why it's only 10.5. Irrigation on lawns, as I said, accounts for 36% of total residential water use. We use 3 million tons of fertilizer, 30,000 tons of synthetic pesticides, 800 million gallons of gasoline in lawnmowers. And interestingly enough, about 2% of that gasoline gets spilled while we're filling up the lawnmowers. That 17 million gallons, or 2.1%, is over 1.5 times more than was spilled off the shores of Alaska by the Exxon Valdez. So, I point some of these things out, not to point a finger, but a lot of people point at agriculture, as a big polluter. I guess I am pointing back a little bit. But, we all need to think about what we're doing a little bit more in that respect. I was fortunate to learn a lot from my father over the years. I wasn't always the quickest study, but some things are a lot more evident than other things. But this next slide really reminds me of growing up and that relationship. The young one is me, but I really like that. Moving on a little bit, along with the idea that civilizations increase entropy and that they fail as they reach certain biophysical limits, comes the idea of excessive complexity. And I would like to quote the guy that wrote this book a little bit. His name was Joseph Tainers, and he argues that the decline of civilizations can often be traced to excessive complexity as it relates to problem solving. Each problem leads to a solution which involves ever greater levels of complexity. Bureaucracies, hierarchies, rules, and regulations consume ever more time, energy, and resources. And as easy solutions to problems are exhausted, problem solving moves to ever greater levels of complexity, higher cost, and lower returns. Indeed, simply maintaining the attained level of complexity in infrastructure, regulation, and expertise consumes ever more resources. The society, which must run ever faster to stay in the same place, eventually collapses. In that sense, human-composed complexity differs greatly from natural complexity with its infinite web of relationships that evolve organically. Human complexity increases cost, where natural systems tend to reduce cost. Nature makes systems more robust, like a web of small streets in a big city. Humans make systems more vulnerable, like a large highway with a toll booth. Nature inspires experimentation, innovation, and correction. Human systems often impede innovation and correction. While entrepreneurs flourish in the natural complexity of a dynamic system, planners often favor complexity in its heavy-handed form because it's easier to understand and manipulate, not because it's more robust. It's also a rich cover in which to hide special favors and privileges that also comes from a moderate greatness. In agriculture, historically, people with mined soils produce food for humans and animals in their care. But the byproduct of this is often erosion, compaction, leaching, losses of organic matter, carbon, water, and nutrients. Furthermore, instead of being returned to the land as they would in nature, end up in latrines and sewers before being released into rivers, lakes, and oceans. Oftentimes, never be recovered again except maybe in the form of pollution. Thus, humans and agriculture tend to increase in. Now, over time, the people involved in agriculture, and people in RCS, and farmers and growers, we have found ways to reduce the worst cost of entropy to our system with such things like compost, manure, no-till, minimum till. And I would just like to say that I have a long ways to go in being a better conservationist, probably in being a better husband and father too, and for sure at being less wasteful. But I would like to praise each of you for your level of conservation and effort. We're doing a lot less tillage, a lot more strip till, no-till, minimum till, and I think it's good to take a minute and sometimes, pat somebody on the back and give them an attaboy, because some of us really don't get enough of those at home. Probably shouldn't have shown it, but Eldon really felt guilty, but sometimes it's just good to get that pat on the back. At this time, I don't really want to talk a lot about what we're doing specifically, because as I said earlier, things are so dynamic and things change so much that once we think we've figured something out, the rules change and we're back to square one. But I would like to go through a few pictures just to show you a couple of things that we're working on and thinking about. Interestingly enough, when Brant and I met and started working together 3 years ago, I had just about completely given up on cover crop. It's just a semi-arid region, and it's kind of a tough sell, really. And he kind of taught me to look at things a little different and kind of evaluate some goals. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. These are kind of the places that we operate in the system. I think that Google Earth is a great planning tool because it's really hard to come up with a good system if you don't have a plan. And I'm not smart enough to keep that plan in my head. And I find that these images and pictures of farms really help me plan things out. We had basically 3 strategies this year. Cotton has always been the hardest thing for us to fit into a no-till system because the ground's cold. And it's really hard to get a lot of early season vigor. And so planting cotton behind corn, the residue is usually hard to deal with. Here's a field where we did nothing but try to distribute it uniformly behind the combine. And we got to a really slow start. We didn't get to plant until the 2nd or 3rd of June. But we did 3 different things. We did nothing. We sowed 15 pounds of wheat cover, and we actually baled some residue to try to remove some warm ground quickly. And just real quickly, that's kind of what it looked like a little later in the season. You still see there's a tremendous amount of residue. This is where we baled the corn stover. You can see there's still quite a bit of residue where it was windrowed, but we took probably 3 tons per acre off of that. I really don't like to do that because it's hard to get rid of that much residue and keep the no-till thing going. But we kind of did it just to see if we could warm the ground up anymore and get any more positive result. But really, what actually worked the best was that 15 pounds of wheat cover. I wish I had some earlier pictures. I know he does. But you can see the little the wheat that's been terminated, and it's actually helping to decompose that crash, the corn stover, and it's also pinning it down and keeping it in place. It's very difficult to plant in the corn stover that hasn't been pinned down. And so this is something that I've been kind of calling pin down cover. 15 pounds, we didn't let it get really big, but we wanted to pin that in place and kind of make it easier to plant. That's just one of the things we kind of worked on. This is a little bit more close-up picture of it. But really, I think that, and I may need that back door Cater was talking about, but I really think that no-till represents our best opportunity to fight the resistant pigweed, because we can layer on some really good chemistries, and it's easier to fight them. The easiest time to fight them is before they come up. And we had pretty good luck. Now, I've got some neighbors that are here, and they know that I've made some mistakes over the years, and I'm not always the cleanest farmer, but we did have good luck controlling the pigweed this year. This guy here is Grant Underwood in the picture, the ugly guy. Wait a minute, that's not Grant. But just to kind of give you a scale of that. Another thing that we noticed is we've always seen a yield penalty in corn on corn. When we don't rotate, we typically have I'd say even a 20 to 30 bushel yield penalty. But that pin down cover, that 15 pounds of winter crop wheat, I believe will just nearly erase that penalty. You can see how uniform that is. Where we had the winter cover, our crops were a lot healthier, a lot more uniform. It's hard to see from the picture, but that is a very uniform field going there. And this is one that's corn on corn that didn't have the cover. You can see how it's wavy. It's not very uniform. And I really think that 15 pounds of cover is what made the difference. It doesn't, as I said, it's somewhat hard to think about growing cover in a semi-arid region, but 15 pounds of wheat, especially when you can really control how much water it uses by when you plant it, when you kill it, if it makes it easier to plant, it's a pretty inexpensive way to do field prep. That's a little close-up shot of some corn that didn't have the cover. You can see the stalks are still pretty healthy. Here's a shot with the cover. It's kind of blurry, but it really aided in the deterioration of the corn stalks, kept it in place, tied it down. That's a shot of the ears with the cover. We had really good uniformity. They were really long before they tipped back. But anyway, that's kind of all I'll say about that. And finally, I would like to just talk just for a moment about the idea of transcending the boundaries that we create. I don't want you to think that, I know this presentation might seem a little odd at a farming conference, and we talked about the problems, really present things. The collapse of civilizations is never a joyful topic. But really, I don't really think that's the real important thing here. We humans tend to create boundaries, have problems with each other, but another thing that I'll close with is that Frank Tinsler, the guy from No-Till Conference, he talked a little bit about this idea of transcending boundaries. And ironically enough, I don't think that the reason that we come here is to be farmers, or to be NRCS field staff, to be doctors. I think that the reason that we come here is to try to learn how to to love each other. And Christ taught that we need to love our enemies. And really that's kind of an odd thing for us to think about. But really, that kind of love and care for one another is the only thing that can get us over the problems. Because really, the reason that civilizations collapse has nothing to do with any of this other stuff. It's just because we simply haven't learned yet how we ought to beat each other. And so, when you think about that concept, we do have some problems, and we do have some things that we need to work on in the future. But it's going to take a lot of creativity to do that. And that union of opposites is really the place where all creativity comes from. I was always amazed, having children that, the time that they grow, there's a space in there when they're around 4 or 5 years old that they have such imagination, such love for everybody around them. Even little booger snatchers that you don't like to be around, they still like to play with them. They're all friends, they all get along. And they can exhaust everything you know about the universe in about 5 minutes. Cater might could last 6, but no one goes toe-to-toe with that kind of imagination. And some people never lose that kind of imagination. So oftentimes we just can't learn to get along with each other. Here's old Rudolph here, and all the other reindeer are used for that, call it names. But that's really not much of a solution. But one of these people that never lost that childlike imagination, I believe, was Albert Einstein. And when you think about him, he was really a neat character. He spent the first 10 years of his life in a patent office considering what it would be like to be a beam of light. And out of that came the special theory of relativity. And he spent the next 10 years developing his general theory of relativity, which is one of the pillars of modern physics, and it completely changed the way that people view the way things work in the physical world. And he spent the remainder of his life developing a general field theory. But really, what's interesting is when he was asked near the end of his life what he thought was most important, you might think that he might at least mention one of these things or something about physics, but he did not. He didn't say a word about it. He said, "I believe in the brotherhood of mankind and the uniqueness of the individual. If you ask me to prove what I believe, I cannot. You know them to be true, but you could spend a lifetime without being able to prove them. There comes a point where the mind takes on a higher plane of understanding, and it can never prove how it got there. These are intuitions that are deep within us. As for creativity, that too is simple enough. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. One cannot help but be in awe when one contemplates the mysteries of eternity, life, or the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if one tries to contemplate a little of this mystery each day. Never lose a holy curiosity." And I think that brotherhood is what we ought to work on as much as anything else, because many minds can work on these problems, and we can really get to the really important things, not the superfluous, superficial things on top. I got a little bit down maybe a few months ago because I just really couldn't imagine what a future would look like. As the water declines for an irrigated farmer, it's hard to think about that, and I can't tell you how long irrigation will last in this area or how long it will be done. But what I can tell you is it's okay that we can't see too far in the future. I think about my granddad in that poster over there with the mule. He was born in 1908, and he used to walk behind the plow with that mule was pulling. And when he retired in the late 70s, they had pretty modern farm equipment. He passed away in 96 and saw very modern farm equipment. When you look at the changes that he saw in his career, do you think he could have ever foreseen that when he was walking behind that mule? And chances are, if things continue, we'll have an opportunity to see even more change in our lifetimes, and some of the things that Peter talked about, than what he actually saw. And so I think that we can get comfortable with not seeing too far in the future. Things never were the way they were, and they never will be again. And once again, I can't stress the ever-changing nature and the reason to constantly reinvent and to work through problems and find solutions. But as we do, we need to strive to go arm in arm with nature rather than toe to toe, because I'm pretty sure we can't win that.